The next plant is eastern redbud. So this is Cercis canadensis from either the Fabaceae or Caesalpinaceae family. It is actually a legume that does not fix nitrogen. It does have the legume pods, as can be seen here. Let me find an example over here. And these cordate leaves, which are very characteristic of eastern redbud, but it does not function to fix nitrogen. It does have a pretty pink or purple flower in the spring, and its foliage actually comes out red rather than this green color when it's first growing. As for wildlife value, there's not really all that much wildlife value. Some birds will eat the seeds, and it's occasionally browsed by deer, but it really does not hold all that much value, unfortunately. It's more commonly used in landscaping than anything else. Alright, so this is Brazilian vervain. It is from the Verbena genus, and its most notable characteristics are that it's an invasive from South America that came up here and takes over disturbed sites. It's actually relatively damaging and has low wildlife value. You can identify it most notably, I believe, by the square stem, which is a feature that's very common with mint-related things. I don't actually know if it's related to mint. It'd be kind of neat. And then these opposite leaves that have this serration that only goes halfway up the leaf to the base. And then these go all the way up the stem. And then probably what could be spotted quickest would be this flower head, which has these nice purple flowers. I don't actually know the inflorescence word for that, but it's very visible among all the other grasses out there, so it's relatively easy to spot. What haven't I talked about? There is actually some pollinator use, but it really is not something that makes up for how much damage it does, considering that it outcompetes all the native species in the area. Alrighty, so what I've got here today, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm here, is actually a Kumaroia genus. So it's Korean Lespidosa or Japanese clover, I believe. And one of the things that is characteristic of Lespidosas, even though it isn't in some genus now, is these itty bitty stipules at the base of the leaf, which unfortunately we can't focus on. But these also have these really neat parallel venation on the three little leaflets that is also not showing up. That's neat. But it is very common in disturbed sites. It is a non-native plant, but unlike some of the other non-native plants, it is actually not all that damaging. It provides a decent source of food for wildlife, especially birds, in the form of its seeds. And the turkeys and rabbits actually eat some of the foliage. It is browsed, and yeah, it actually does not cause all that much harm, surprisingly. That's Japanese clover. It's rather unique. It's actually got this really neat way of creating the leaves. They come out in a cool way. Anyways, that's Japanese clover. There, under the tree, is poison ivy, Toxicodendron radicans. It is actually a plant of very high wildlife value. It is used as a browse and as bird food. But moving on to identification characteristics, you are going to see a compound leaf with 3 leaflets. However, these may have a jagged or entire margin, and not all things with 3 leaflets are poison ivy. If poison ivy specifically has an alternate leaf pattern arrangement, and it sometimes has a hairy vine. It has several different growth forms it can take, including this, a tree climbing vine and a sort of shrubby thing. And it contains the irritant urushiol, which is actually what causes the reaction to poison ivy. This has a very high wildlife value, not only because it is a browse, but because birds, especially migratory birds, feed on the waxy white fruit during the cold months. So that's poison ivy. Pretty cool. Thing right here, that is trumpet creeper. It is Campsis radicans. It is actually a tree climbing vine in most cases, but this is an itty bitty one. We know that it is Campsis radicans and not peppervine because it has singular pinnately compound leaves. They are odd pinnately compound, but they're not bipinnately compound. Seeing that they both come out of the same node, they're opposite. This has a wildlife value in that its red trumpet-shaped flowers that it develops as it grows help feed pollinators and especially the ruby-throated hummingbird. And then it also climbs up into the canopy of trees and provides a lot of shelter and structure for nesting creatures. So Campsis radicans actually has a pretty decent wildlife value. The jagged margins visible on these leaflets are very common of Campsis radicans. But usually what people are looking at and see as the most obvious is this leaf arrangement and then those bright red-orange trumpet flowers. This here is late boneset, or another very closely related Eupatorium. If it is late boneset, it's Eupatorium serotinum. Characteristic of Eupatorium is these opposite leaves that are going in perpendicular directions. And then you also have this doubly serrate margin that can be seen on some of the leaves, which is also characteristic of Eupatorium. But late boneset very specifically has some of this purple coloration, which you can see that this plant is picking up, and these lanceolate to oval shaped leaves. It doesn't actually have all that much wildlife value besides that of supporting some of the pollinators, particularly the butterflies. But beyond that, late boneset doesn't have that much actual wildlife value. It can provide a little bit of structure, but not that much. That's late boneset, or something really close. It doesn't actually have the white flower at the top yet, although Eupatorium do all develop that white flower cluster. So this is Alabama supplejack, or Berkemia scandens. It is a native twining vine. Its most obvious features are that it has these alternate leaves that are usually oval shaped or a little bit pointed, and they have these parallel venation, and because of that parallel venation they have this sort of scalloped margin, which is very much visible in Alabama supplejack. It's got a fruit that lasts from most of the fall months, so it goes from August to September and actually persists in November. So it's a rather important bird food. Turkeys, quails, squirrels, they'll all eat it, and then it's actually a high preference deer browse. And like Campsis radicans, this actually does add to some of the canopy structure so that birds and other wildlife can use it to nest in. So this is something in the Rubus genus. Based off of what we were told about 5 leaflets, it may be dewberry, but I'm not too sure of that, so we're just going with blackberry. It is a native perennial semi-woody plant. And it has these compound leaves with either 3 or 5 leaflets with these very much serrated edges. Sometimes the new growth is red in these species. The Rubus species actually have 2 sets of thorns. They have these larger thorns and then these small, almost fuzzy thorns on them. In addition to this, they have alternate leaf arrangement. They're considered to be the most important wildlife plant in the south in some cases, and they're very much a power 6 plant. Deer absolutely adore these things. Everything adores them. Some birds actually build their entire lives around these things. They're used for structure, food, all kinds of stuff. So basically, Rubus is pretty cool. This right here is Eastern Baccharis, so Baccharis halimophilia, I believe is the name. It is a semi-evergreen shrub that exists in the south. It is actually very much salt tolerant, so we see it a lot around marine areas because it can actually live there. It doesn't actually have all that much wildlife value. Nothing really eats it. But the way you identify it is by these alternate or almost spiraling leaves in some cases. And then it has these green stems usually. They get a little bit woody at some point and lose some of the color. but typically they're very much green, dark green. And then they do have toothed margins, but it only begins halfway up the leaf. They do have an achene fruit, which is, I believe, wind dispersed, so it is not very much something that wildlife eat. Anyways, this is also a dioecious species. So you see two different sexes. I don't know if it's male or female. It was a sprout I actually found back there. So that's eastern baccharis. So this is Japanese honeysuckle, Lonicera japonica. It is an invasive and non-native to the US, although it is considered naturalized. It does, however, crowd out the native honeysuckle, coral honeysuckle, so that's significant. This is usually identified by its paired opposite leaves, which do not always take this ovoid shape. Sometimes they could be lobed or of a different phenology. They have relatively fuzzy stems and leaves, and I believe the coral honeysuckle actually has a fused couple of end leaves, while this has them separated. It actually does have some decent wildlife value. Birds will eat it, that's how it's got spread so far, and then deer will absolutely browse it if they happen upon it. So they are actually semi-evergreen, which is kind of weird. And they do have these bright white yellow flowers that everyone's very much familiar with. So yeah. Alrighty, so this is Chinese privet. It is extremely invasive here. It was brought in for landscaping purposes because people thought it was pretty, and it turns out that it produces a whole lot of very viable seeds. So Ligustrum sinense has this even pinnate leaf where this entire thing is one leaf. I was actually very surprised to learn. They are semi-evergreen, and unfortunately they do exhibit what's considered extended leaf phenology. So they will sit there and outcompete all the other shrubs because they're still alive and they're still performing photosynthesis. They will resprout from their roots, and birds happen to love the berries, so they get dispersed by animals very quickly. As I actually took off the twig there, but there was some evidence of browsing by deer because they do very much enjoy this plant. So yeah, the berries are actually available from October to February, and this actually does help to support birds over the winter. So that's Chinese privet. So this is Virginia creeper, Parthenocissus quinquefolia. It is a native vine. It does climb by tendrils, but it does have the unique adaptation of these sort of adhesive pad tendrils. They look like a bunch of little bitty rootlets that go into the tree, rather than it just wrapping around what it's trying to climb. They typically do have these 5-leaflet palmately compound leaves, but you will sometimes see 3 leaflets. They are whorled to opposite leaves, and they're very much serrated like this. That's pretty typical of the species. And they do produce a drupe. This drupe feeds things through the winter, so October to February, which does make it a relatively important wildlife plant. It also does provide much of the same benefits as any other vine that climbs trees does. It helps provide some of that cover in the canopy for birds as they're nesting. Is there anything I've forgotten? I don't know. I don't know if deer eat them necessarily, but they're kind of a cool critter. Okay, so this is box elder. I promise it's not poison ivy. First off, it's got 5 leaflets, and then it's got this opposite leaf arrangement, which poison ivy does not have and box elder does. That is a significant issue because box elder can have, and very often does have, 3 leaflets to a leaf. It can also have 1 leaflet to a leaf if it's incredibly immature, but they often have these serrated edges, which poison ivy may have. Box elder has green twigs, typically. They can be purplish green. I've seen a couple of those. They typically live in riparian areas, and I believe this is Acer negundo, since I did not mention that. They don't have that much wildlife value, but I believe they were used to make syrup. Native Americans made syrup out of box elder. A couple of bird species and small mammals do eat the samaras, but as samaras are wind dispersed, they don't really appeal to wildlife all that much. But yeah, this is box elder. So this is Smilax species. It is a type of greenbrier, and they are actually a very high wildlife value plant. They're actually one of the power 6 plants, and the deer absolutely adore these, and they're also eaten by rabbits. The fruit also appeal to birds and other small mammals, and this is actually why they've developed two different significant defenses against intense herbivory. They have these spines on the stems, which can vary in length based on herbivory, and then they have a rhizome, which is a layer of roots, an extensive root system underground that they can sprout back from if they're chewed down. But they are an alternate leaf. They can have very much varied leaf shapes. Typically they're shinier on top and then kind of white on the bottom. This is a type of vine, and it's... I'm trying to see if there's anything that I just forgot about. Oh, they have this actually incredibly high, well, not incredibly high, but relatively high crude protein at about 25%. And yeah, if you're feeding 40 different species of birds in one plant, that's pretty great. So, as my cameraman got kind of bit up by ants, we're now hiding in my car. But this is a Desmodium, something within the genus. There are quite a few species, but they're defined by these alternating 3 leaflets, and those 3 leaflets have a little pair of stipules at the base of the leaf and at the base of each of the leaflets. So they are actually very high wildlife value in general. They produce a lot of seed that northern bobwhite quail absolutely adore, and then they are very heavily browsed by deer. While this is not always the morphology they take, sometimes they have thinner or thicker leaves, like much thicker. They are absolutely one of the power 6 plants, so they are extremely highly browsed by deer. An interesting fact is that they have like this very high crude protein in drought, so that they maintain, what is it, above like 16% protein during a drought. But the seeds on these are actually dispersed by fur because they're fuzzy and a little bit sticky, just like the leaves. So this is black cherry. It's wilted a little bit because I've had it out in heat for a while, but it's Prunus serratina, and serratina actually matches up relatively well because they do have serrated leaves. They are an alternate leaf arrangement, and then you'll see these horizontal lenticels on black cherry twigs and stems. That isn't necessarily very much visible when they're big trees because they get this strange, blocky, almost burnt-looking bark when they're big trees. But probably the most characteristic thing of black cherry is this orange fuzz along the midrib, and it goes about halfway up from the leaf base. So these actually do have pretty high wildlife value, with a word of caution. They do produce soft mass that absolutely everything loves, but they do have a plant secondary compound defense, and it's not precisely that they produce it, but the crushed up cherry leaves and twigs will actually spill their contents to produce cyanide, which is not the most friendly chemical. It can kill livestock rather easily. This is a member of the Oxalis genus, most likely Oxalis stricta, so yellow-wood sorrel. And probably the most visible feature at first would be these little 3 leaves that are always at the end. They're heart-shaped, unlike other little things that look similar. Yellow-wood sorrel also has these little yellow flowers that occur, and these tiny, almost ochre-like seed capsules or fruits. Also, oxalis are notable because the foliage and the little bitty ochre bits actually taste like lemons, so far as I've heard. Haven't actually tried that, but these are rather important wildlife food. They work for birds and small mammals, but we see that its most notable use is for the falcate orange-tip butterfly, I believe that's the name. They depend on the species pretty significantly. So, yeah. This is goldenrod. It is a part of the Solidago genus. I do not believe it is narrow-leaf goldenrod. I think it's regular goldenrod. But typically this is very visible because of its cascading yellow flower head that kind of droops off to one side, bright yellow flowers, but it doesn't yet have those. So you're looking mostly at these alternate kind of spiraling leaves with a little bit of serration. And then you have a lot of volume towards the top with those. This is considered a relatively common allergen, but it is often blamed for ragweed allergies, which is rather unfortunate. So these can actually grow about 4 feet tall on average. They get pretty spiky looking. As I said, it has that flower head. That flower head is composed of many little bright yellow flowers. And this is actually a relatively important wildlife food, especially for American goldfinch, which subsists on it. And it also acts as good cover and structure for a lot of species. When did you start recording?
Just a moment ago.
Alrighty, oops. This would be peppervine. It is Ampelopsis arborea. I'm going to go right off the bat and say, usually peppervine has a little bit darker foliage than things it could be mistaken for, like trumpet creeper, but that's not necessarily definitive. That is how I pick it out, though. Anyways, this has a bipinnately compound leaf. As you can see, the leaf starts here. So this is one leaf of peppervine. They do have the serrations like trumpet creeper, but trumpet creeper is only pinnately compound, so say this would be one leaf. They often have this sort of rosy color on the stem that you can see in peppervine, and they get these very dark colored soft mass berries that are loved by a lot of small mammals and birds. Most notably raccoons just love them. But yeah, the fruit's ripe from September to December, and it doesn't actually make that great of deer forage, but its contribution to food sources for wildlife is relatively important. This would be sumpweed, so Iva annua. It is a native plant and is relatively common in disturbed sites and wet marshy areas, and that just happens to be the combination that I found this one in. It's actually pretty unique looking. If you look at that leaf, it's got these 3 veins, and that doesn't really look like all that much else. Sumpweed has very pubescent stems and leaves, but it's this sort of sandpapery pubescence. It also has this serration. It's not particularly dense serration, but it does happen. The leaf pattern is opposite in sumpweed. And for wildlife use, they actually are pretty good for the rearing of turkey and quail. They are pretty good cover for that, just because you have this setup where there's a lot of volume here and then a little space here, so it's good for the itty-bitty ones hiding. But yeah, sumpweed is pretty unique looking, so it's easy to spot from a few feet away.